Welcome back to Harbor. That was, of course, New York Congressman, the inimitable Charlie Rangel of New York City, right here on Hardball early this week, saying that his people back home in New York don't want any part of the war in Syria. Rangel's constituents, like many in districts across the country, show little appetite for intervention abroad these days. And it is these members of Congress, torn between their loyalty to the president, these are African-American members of Congress, and their opposition, in fact, the opposition by their constituents to any involvement in this war, who may make or break the president's request for congressional approval of the attack on Syria. According to Foreign Policy magazine and The Hill magazine, the leader of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, asked her members to limit their comments while House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi makes the push for the president. And one of those members who's breaking her silence a bit right now is Representative Barbara Lee, a California Democrat from Oakland and from Berkeley, and the only member of the United States Congress to vote against the authorization for use of force in Afghanistan after 9/11. She joins us now. Also joining us, by the way, is New York Times columnist, congressional reporter Jeremy Peters, who's covering this debate. What are your feelings? I mean, you've got a mix of things going. I assume, I'm guessing, as a Democrat, you're a loyalist to the president, but at the same time, other factors. What are those other factors in your thinking about this resolution that's coming to the House next week to authorize the president to go after Assad?
Sure, Chris. Thank you. I continue to support the president. I have. And actually, I was the first member of the California delegation to endorse the president. And I certainly believe that he has moved cautiously. He's been very methodical in how he has approached Syria. And in fact, he did the right thing by coming to Congress asking for this authorization. I, however, feel that there are other options. It's just not a military option or no option, Chris. There are other options. I think what we saw take place in the Senate is really an example of what can happen when you have a military option as being the only option. This could end up in a regional conflict. It could end up with more people getting killed, more retaliation. And Chris, I worry so much about the collateral damage that could occur, and I don't believe this can be contained to surgical strikes, because we know that there are unintended consequences when surgical strikes take place. And in fact, my concern is that more harm could be done. Having said that, we must hold the Assad regime, and I believe the evidence is very credible, the intelligence is credible. We have to hold him accountable. The world has to come together and address the use of chemical weapons in these horrific crimes. But your previous segment laid it out. This is a civil war taking place in Syria. There are so many unknowns that are going on in Syria, Chris. And so why in the world wouldn't we look at alternatives rather than make some decision to use force, not understanding what the full implications are? But I have to commend the president for coming to Congress, because now we see what this debate, how this debate is taking place, and we see what the possibilities are, and we see that many of us are very concerned that a political settlement and a negotiated settlement would be set way back if, in fact, the use of force is enacted right away.
Okay, let me go to Jeremy on the New York Times. Jeremy Peters, let me ask you about the whole scope of the Black Caucus, which grows every year. There's more members of the caucus, so almost 50 members right now. What is this sort of, is Congresswoman Lee an example of the, I mean, Charlie Rangel the other day came right out against the president. Now, he may have issues with Obama, period. Right. But because of going back, everybody's got issues one way or the other. Is this pretty much the theme now? They love Obama. They like the fact that they get to vote on it, but they're going to vote no.
Well, I think with members like Charlie Rangel, it's easier for the White House to discount that, because there's a feeling that Charlie Rangel is still upset that the White House didn't come out and back him when he was having
problems. Well, they were worse
than
that. Now, they were very discourteous to a senior member of the House. But go ahead.
Well,
they were
that
tough.
aside, I do think there are a number of members whom the White House is watching very carefully. And those are the ones who are going back home, and they're having 95% of their constituents say this is a bad idea. And this is a concern for the president, because these are districts where Obama is exceedingly popular.
I know.
So, his problems in the rest of the country don't
Well, let's
matter
get these numbers. Let's get to these numbers. I want to go back to the Congresswoman. One last shot from you. You say 95% against this war. The country, what's the country? 80% against the war?
60,
Chris, let me say.
Yeah, I'll go back to you, Congressman. Go ahead.
Yeah, Chris, first of all, this is a democracy. People have a right and a duty to voice their concern and provide their input into matters of war and peace. And I think the African American community, like every community in our country, has that duty and responsibility to voice their opinion in this great democracy. Also, let me just say, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus, and the Congressional Black Caucus has not taken a position. Our chair is a wonderful, very strong chair, and in fact, several members of the Congressional Black Caucus have spoken out in terms of voicing their opinion whether or not they believe that the authorization to use force should be supported or not. I personally believe that there are other options and that we need to exhaust all of the other options because, as Senator Kerry said, there's no military solution, and in fact, we've got to get to a negotiated settlement. Military action leads us further away from achieving that goal.
Well, some members of the Congressional Black Caucus right now have spoken out about this in your article with the Times. Let me quote some of the people from your piece. Freshman Congressman Hakeem Jeffries of New York said, there are two major considerations to take into account: the prestige of an administration we strongly support versus an open-ended conflict in the Middle East that risks the lives of the people we represent if war were to break out, not to mention the diversion of resources back into our own communities that's sorely needed. His colleague from New York, Congressman Greg Meeks, we know him, he said, I wasn't elected just to go along to get along. I was elected to utilize my thought process and to determine what I think is in the best interest of my district. So you've got a lot of this, and I guess the reason why we're talking with full respect about this caucus, the CBC, is that they are the base of the Democratic Party.
Well, they're not only the base of the Democratic Party.
They're the heart of the party, you might say.
Absolutely. They're the base of Barack Obama's support. But also, he's not going to be able to lose very many votes in the House to have this resolution approved. And I think so. When every vote counts, you want these...
Let me go to Congressman Lee on this. You know, I worked on the Hill, as you know, Congresswoman, and you know when it gets down to the close vote at the end, and the leadership, whether it's Steny or it's Mrs. Pelosi, they get everybody in that corral, and they say, we may need your vote. Do you think they're going to get your vote if they really, really need it?
Chris, as you mentioned earlier, I voted against the authorization to use force as it related to Afghanistan right after the horrific events of 9/11, where over 3,500 Americans and people in our own country were killed. That was a blank check. It was a terrible moment. That was a resolution that authorized the use of force until we repeal that. That's been used for drone attacks, for surveillance activities, and for other conflicts in terms of our resources and our troops. And so it is very difficult for me to figure out a way where I could vote for the use of force when I understand what's going on in Syria and know and believe Secretary Kerry and the President that the only way we can achieve some resolve, hold the Assad regime accountable, and stop the violence is by a negotiated and political settlement, and the use of force leads us further away from that position. And so too much is at risk. This could end up in a regional war. Retaliation could occur. And so this would be very difficult for me. And Chris, I am not going to support this effort.
You know what? I have to say to the Congresswoman, thank you for coming on, and thank you, Jeremy. Having read the Senate resolution passed by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last night with the full power of John McCain and his new satellite, I guess, Chris Coons of Delaware, a totally hawkish document. It goes well beyond retaliation or punishment or any kind of punitive raid for what happened with regard to chemical weapons. It's basically a mandate to get involved in this war and support the rebels. I think you're right, Congresswoman. I'd be careful of the language. You got to be careful of the language of these hawks because they love to sneak it in there. Up next,